Do you like the Kinsey scale as a sort of very simple reduction to that there's a spectrum? I also saw the client sexual orientation grid that adds a few parameters like who you're attracted to, how you're actually behaving, the fantasies you have, social preference, lifestyle preferences, all that kind of stuff, self-identification, what you actually say publicly, all those different dimensions. Or is the Kinsey scale like pretty damn good approximation?
The Kinsey scale is a good start. And the Klein grid, I think, is much more fun in some ways. So the Klein grid came out of research by Alfred Kinsey and others like Havelock Ellis, but we won't get into him. And Fritz Klein was a male researcher doing research also on bisexuality. He was specifically a therapist, and he was looking at people who were struggling with their sexuality. And so people would show up in the 70s and 80s in his practice, and they would say, I'm struggling with my sexuality. And he would say, how can I help you? And they would say things like, I wish I wasn't interested in men, and I'm a man. And he would then work through sort of what that means. Does that mean you don't want to have these feelings? Does that mean that you don't want to have these attractions? Does that mean that it's the implications of like how your friends and family will see you? That's the problem. And so he created this much more complex scale, which I think is really interesting for everybody to do, no matter what their sexuality is. Because what it is it gets you to think about things like, yeah, your sexual identity, easy. But not just that, but in past, present, and ideal. And so if you say, well, I used to identify as straight, now I identify as bisexual, and then I have in my head, this doesn't mean that other people think this, in my head, I have an ideal, which could be straight, because that's what maybe society's told us we should be, but it could also be something else. And so I've also had friends who've gone, past, present, straight, but ideal bi. So you get into these interesting dynamics where sometimes people just wish they were a different sexuality than they were for other reasons. And then there's other things in the scale that ask about your lifestyle. So, for example, if you are going to parties, queer parties, if you have queer friends, then you might have a homosexual lifestyle, even if you're straight. But then again, it's how much lifestyle would you like? And so for me, that was a real moment where I was looking at that going, wow, my lifestyle is really straight. And maybe I need to change this. And so he was using these attractions and fantasies and identities and the past, present, ideal to help people to think through all these complicated feelings we have around our sexuality and to identify problem like sticking points.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So maybe the presumption there is if everything is aligned, the fantasies, the ideal partner, all of those things, that's probably the healthiest place to be.
Right. And so he would look at especially the ideal and the present. And if those were different, so if you said, I wish I was bi, but I'm straight, or I am bi, but I wish I was straight, or I'm homosexual and I wish I was straight, he would say, let's talk about that. And he'd try to work through it. And the term he used for bisexual people who were uncomfortable in their own sexuality was being a troubled bisexual. And so I think any sexuality can be troubled. I think you could be a troubled straight person, a troubled homosexual person, a troubled asexual person. And just thinking about why and which aspects are maybe missing, I think is really healthy for people to do.
Meaning there's some puzzles that you haven't quite figured out. Maybe you haven't been honest with yourself about your preferences, all that kind of stuff.
I don't really like talking about honesty with yourself. I think that's a high bar. And I think it's also often weaponized against people, especially by men, whereas this idea of you're not really being honest, you're actually gay. And so I think this idea of we're not being honest with our own sexuality, that's a big word. I think it's more that maybe you haven't had the right framework or the right words to think about aspects of your sexuality that are troubling to you.